So I think we are all set. If you need the QR code, again, as I mentioned, alternate tables have those. It's also on the door, so feel free to fill out the survey as you see. So yeah, special thanks to Professor Jean Camp and as well as Indiana University Bloomington, who have sponsored the awards and certificates here, and NDSS organizers. Without their help, it would not have been possible to organize USEC Symposium. The program committee as well as the authors, of course. So let me give you some of the statistics about the program selection process and so on. First, we had an astonishing 41 submissions this year, which is an increase of 20% to the 34 submissions last year, which is great. And we want to keep this momentum up. So all of you who have submitted, definitely submit again next year, but also make sure who are attending, they try again, right? Thanks to the chairs for some of the last iterations of the USEC. We have tried to reach out to the last 15 years. So this is the 15th year of USEC, which is amazing, right, how it started. And we got some stats from there as well. So we have some insights on how USEC was developed. Overall, while the program has grown in size, there are, of course, some of the limitations in the number of accepted paper to fit into a one-day symposium. Hence, we have seen USEC to become more competitive. This year, the acceptance rate fell under 50% in comparison to last year's. However, we also see a very positive development that after COVID-related drop, we are again back on track. Again, thanks to all the great researchers who have submitted their work and the authors that are present here today. So as we can see, there were some 41 submissions. It has been increased. We have done some good statistics on that. I thought the screen was moving, but you can see the acceptance rate and so on. Another great thing what we found out that the USEC community is also becoming more international. This year we had submissions for 12 countries all over the world, including Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Finland, or Ireland as well. This also supports the growing USEC community. Of course, there is a great room for improvement. You see a lot of grays here in the map. So in the future, we want to see that all of the areas globally, we have something, apart from maybe Antarctica, but who knows. So this year we have 79 authors from 7 of these countries, including Japan and Finland, as I said. So this is a little bit of distribution from where the submissions came through. It is also great to see collaborations in our community. The average accepted paper for USEC 25 had 4.3 authors from 2.1 affiliations. Again, these are numbers, but of course, like we have more than 4 authors on an average. Particularly noteworthy was 2 accepted papers, where one had 5 authors from 5 affiliations from 3 countries, and one paper had 7 authors from 5 affiliations all over the US. So it is amazing to see such collaborations happening in the USEC community. In regards to topics favored by authors, we had submissions from pretty much all areas we can think about, with some clearly being more favored, such as psychological, sociological, and economics aspects of security and privacy research, and design methodologies or usability evaluations. However, better chances for acceptance this year were apparently for research and design methodologies, so we definitely saw that people want to know about how the studies were conducted, which is really an impressive thing. Overall, however, this shows the breadth of the program that was selected this year, and there should be something for everyone here where they can learn something. So we have created this program, which seems amazing to us, but hopefully all of you enjoy it too. And again, as I said, a heartfelt thank you to all our exceptional program committee. If you are here, again, thank you so much. We recognize the significant effort and extra hours invested during the busy holiday season. As you could see, during the submission and the other time, there have been the holiday season, and they have worked throughout it. And we deeply appreciate everyone's unwavering commitment and diligence here. Special thanks to our Ninja reviewers. We had to bring in some Ninja reviewers when there were some conflicts or we were requiring some last-minute inputs as well, so special thanks to them. Again, so now we have all the bookkeeping staff. It's time to announce the Test of Time Award. I have announced already online so that you know, some of you at least. But this goes to the paper on a conundrum of permissions installing applications on Android smartphone. So towards later, we will have the Test of Time Award closing note as well. So please attend that. But this particular literature talks about the usability of Android permission systems and had a great influence on numerous works in this domain. Is one of the first usable security papers in the domain of smartphone security when a large part of the community was looking more into the system security aspects. Its insights were essential for building a better permission systems on smartphones. Those among you that use Android for a longer time might remember the times of install time permissions. and won't miss it because they are basically useless for end users. Rightfully, it has been cited for almost 500 times according to Google Scholar since 2012, where it was first presented at USEC, and it's still being actively cited. Again, this particular selection was done, but of course by the chairs, but in addition, we also had a test of time award committee, so we cumulatively took this decision, and we hope that you really enjoy this presentation later in the day. Now, this one we have not really announced, but we want to mention it now so that you definitely attend all of the presentations, but congratulations to the authors of a field study to uncover a tool to support the alert investigation process of Tier 1 analysis. So some of the quotes from the reviewers mentioned, this is a fantastic paper, the methods explanation is excellent, so it is easy to understand what was done. Even the coding strategy is explained in such great detail, which I rarely seen before. Then there is the fact that the two studies were conducted a year apart in cybersecurity research. Many scholars do not take the time to conduct such studies, nice setup. So people who have mentioned, authors follow sound methodology, authors explore development of a support system for new SOC analysis. There was a novel two-part study, and again, the methodology of the work has been definitely really appreciated. So we present this as the fifth paper in the afternoon session, but of course, these are all kind of, like who got the scoring and everything, but all of the papers we feel are definitely very valuable, so please attend all of the sessions. So a little bit about the schedule. First, we have the opening remarks. Then we have our opening keynote, a break. So the break will be common. So if you are feeling that, oh, I'm missing some of the people who are attending other symposiums, feel free to network during the break sessions. Then there is paper session 1, lunch. Again, we all are going to have cumulative lunch through the NDSS. And then break, paper session 2, then we have the invited test of time award, and then the closing remarks, and we have a reception too. So we have enough time for networking outside of the symposium as well. So some of the logistics, where is the coffee break? I have to figure out myself, but this is going to be this area itself, so we can figure it out together. And conference proceedings are available if you want to go online and check again some of the details. For the full paper, the presentation is 14 minutes, 10 minutes of the talk time. So I do have these indicators of 2 minutes and stop, right? So when we are stopping, if you're not stopping at that point of time, then we have to cut short the Q&A session. Then the vision papers are, again, these are papers which are thought-provoking, so it has 12 minutes, 8 minutes of talk, and 4 minutes of Q&A. We really encourage all of you to ask Q&A. This is an in-person symposium. There is only one other speaker who could not attend, who will be joining online. The audio works, so you can ask your question, and I'll repeat, and I'll try my best to kind of do that. So yeah, that said, please enjoy USEC 2025. And so first, as we start, I would really like to welcome Dr. Vaibhav Garg as our opening keynote speaker, who is the Executive Director of Cybersecurity and Privacy Research and Public Policy Research at Comcast Cable. He has a PhD in Security Informatics from Indiana University and an MS in Information Security from Purdue University. I don't know how he managed to do both, given that we are rivals. I'm kidding, right? But yes, his research investigates the intersection of cybersecurity, economics, and public policy. He has co-authored over 30 peer-reviewed publications and received the Best Paper Award at the 2011 eCrime Researchers Summit for his work on the economics of cybercrime. He previously served as the editor-in-chief of ACM Computer and Security, and he received the ACM SIGCAS Outstanding Service Award. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vaibhav Garg, and we have a small memento for him. Okay, Sven, I think we are bidding bye to you, but thank you so much for joining, and I'll pass over to Vaibhav now.
Yes, no problem. Thanks, and enjoy the day.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope the caffeine is kicking in. Just bear with me for a second while I set up. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation, and anyone wants to guess my password, feel free to do that. So Sanjay mentioned, so I'm Vaibhav Garg. I also go by VG. Those are my initials. I know my name is not the easiest to pronounce. And I'm an executive director at Comcast. I've been with the company for 8 years, finishing 8 years in January. And during that time, I wear a couple of different hats. One is I have a team of around 35 researchers and developers building new security and privacy engineering solutions that we use in-house. And then we also open source some of those technologies. But then the second part of my hat is doing cybersecurity, privacy, AI, tech policy work. And one of the things that I've been kind of really interested in, how do we design tech policy or public policy for cybersecurity, privacy, what have you, that is usable in nature? So so most of the talk is going to really focus on designing cybersecurity tech policy, but all of those lessons and findings kind of apply to anything that is other tech policy. So I know it is kind of really early in the morning. I know some of you had gone out last night, so maybe you're still kind of in the process of waking up. If you miss any part of the talk, if you have to step out for any reason, I do want you to make sure that you take away sort of 3 things from this talk. And all of those 3 things are in 3 papers. There's QR codes for that. So the first takeaway is that policy making is significantly more complex than policy ideation. And what that means, I'll go into the details of that later in the talk. The second one is that one-size-fits-all policy is neither needed nor is it appropriate when it comes to cybersecurity tech policy. And the third one is that covenants without the sword are possible via community-based self-governance. And covenants without the sword, it really means that oftentimes when you think about making cybersecurity policy, we think about, if someone's not doing the right thing, then we need to penalize them. So we need to have some kind of a sword or penalty hanging over the head of people in order to make sure that they comply. But as I'll show, that's not necessarily always needed. So those are the 3 takeaways. So with that, I'm going to jump into the talk. So let's, start at the beginning. So, most people have probably recognized Ross Anderson, former keynote speaker at USEC. Also, arguably, one of the people who came up with the field of cybersecurity economics, recently passed away. He about a little bit more than 20 years ago, he wrote a paper called Why Information Security is Hard, an Economic Perspective. And that paper really sort of defined, in my opinion, and the opinion of many other people, the way we think about economics in cybersecurity and how economics and cybersecurity interact, how economics drive cybersecurity investment or lack thereof. And he makes this observation that really, cybersecurity is a technical problem, but it's really more than that. And it's a problem of misaligned incentives. And those misaligned incentives lead to underinvestment in cybersecurity. So the first misaligned incentive that he talks about is information asymmetry. And this is not my work, obviously. This is Professor Anderson's work. There's a reference in the bottom of the slide. So information asymmetry basically means that consumers do not have a way to differentiate secure products from insecure products in the market. So if I cannot differentiate those products in the market on security, I don't necessarily have a way to pay more for a secure product. And because I do not have a way to pay more for a secure product, the vendor has no incentive to build a more secure product. So that's information asymmetry. And over time, what that gives you is a market of security lemons. The second one is about externalities. So if you think of, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Mirai botnet attack, he makes the argument that the cost of insecure devices is not borne by the vendor of the product or by the customer of that product, but it's really borne by a third party. So it creates a negative externality that is not absorbed by either the first party or the second party, but it's imposed on the third party. So in the case of the Mirai botnet attack, the people who manufacture, or the company that manufactured the cameras that were insecure, that's fine. It didn't bother them. And the people who installed those cameras, it had very little impact on them. it only had impact on Netflix and Dine and those kinds of people, right? So negative externalities. And the final one is network effects. So when you're originally coming to the market with a product, right, what do you want? You want as many people to use it or as many people, so organizations or entities to use it. Now, if you build in a ton of security into that product, that's going to add some friction for the user, right? So what you do is that, potentially you under provision security, you make the platform, service, product as open as you possibly can, so it can be adopted as quickly as, as possibly can. So there, all of these three kind of misaligned incentives lead to an underinvestment in cybersecurity. At least that's the argument that Ross made in that paper. And there are examples of products that kind of exist in all of these different spaces that kind of show how information asymmetry. So my favorite example is smart TVs. A couple of years ago, I wanted to buy a smart TV. And because I'm a I'm a decent cybersecurity professional, I really wanted to get a TV that was really secure, and was almost impossible to kind of figure out which TV had better security than which other TV. And if that's a challenge for me, I would argue that that's a challenge for most people. So, given that kind of all of these kinds of problems, there are other researchers that have come up with policy interventions or policy solutions to address these problems. So when you talk about information asymmetry, they're like, well, why don't we create a market signal that allows consumers to differentiate between secure and insecure products? So in this case, the market signal that people are proposing is called cyber labels, or IoT security labels. These are pretty common now across the world. Finland was, I think, one of the first countries to come up with it. It's called, I'm not going to try and pronounce it, but let's say So Finland's had the first one. Singapore has it. Other countries have it. U.S. U.S. is a little bit behind some other countries, but U.S. has something called the U.S. trust mark that is currently in the process of being. They're trying to figure out the details around that. And then when it comes to externalities, there's this notion that you can apply strict liability. So a strict liability basically means that you can basically say that you have to build in a certain amount of security, and if the government believes that you did not do your due diligence, then ex post, if there's a problem with the product, then ex post after there is a problem, the government can basically sanction you. So you can have ex post sanctions imposed by different entities, for example, the Federal Trade Commission. And then finally, you can also have ex ante regulation, which basically means that you need to be this tall if you want to get onto the internet, right? So you need to have certain basic cybersecurity practices that are or cybersecurity controls that are built in, or you have adhered to basic cybersecurity practices before you have launched your product on the market. So there are things, there's some security requirements and things like ground leaf blithely. PCI DSS is more of a industry way of saying, hey, if you want to process credit card transactions, you need to have a baseline level of security. There's the California IoT law, which says, hey, any IoT device needs to come with a unique default password. So, and these are not the only kind of policy interventions that have been proposed. There are lots of other ones. So these are just some examples. The thing is that all of these policy interventions have limitations or challenges when you start to kind of at the end of the day, the devil is in the details, right? So when you start to looking at the details, you're like, okay, well, how do I actually make this intervention into a policy solution? So if you're thinking of labeling, right? So when we say cybersecurity labeling, first we have to define what security is, what kind of a label do we want to use, and what actually goes on the label. If you're looking at strict liability, ex post liability is quite hard to attribute, especially when you're talking about software, for example, because software is a combination of any product is really a combination of many other products. So how do you assign strict liability? Anyone who's been following the debate about the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe, might have noticed that there's been some liabilities that were assigned to developers of open source components and open source software, and it was heavily criticized by the Electronic Frontier Foundation amongst other organizations. So it's really hard to make that kind of policy. Ex ante liability is constrained by the knowledge of the regulator. So how expert is the regulator in understanding the technology to figure out, what should be the baseline security requirements. The problem in cybersecurity is because the threat surface or, the threat vectors constantly evolve, and the regulator is not necessarily the entity who is the expert in what is the latest threat. It's hard for them to come up with a baseline set of requirements. By the way, these are not arguments that I have made. Well, one of them, the first one is an argument that I have made, which is in the first paper. But then there's a paper from Tyler Moore who talks about the economics of cybersecurity principles and policy options, and why ex ante and ex post liabilities are hard to assign. But the other challenge with this kind of regulatory approach to cybersecurity is it's really kind of constrained to a specific jurisdiction. United States can only make laws about United States, but cybersecurity often tends to have global dependencies, and so that's really hard to regulate. The other concern sometimes becomes that if you have a lot of kind of requirements around, hey, you need to be this tall in order to get on the internet, you can potentially create a barrier to entry in the market where only a few products are able to enter the market, in which case you're going to centralize all of your risk in those small set of products. You're not going to have enough variety of products on the market, and so you can centralize your risk in that product. Dan Geer has a very nice paper on why that is a problem, and basically makes the argument that if you have concentration of cybersecurity risk, it pretty much doesn't matter how many controls you build in, you're always going to see breaches. So basically, you can come up with policy ideas, but then when you actually try and build policy around it, it's actually very hard to build. So let's see an example of how that works out in practice. So I'm going to start with the example of I'm going to use the example of labeling. So, like I said, if you're talking about cybersecurity labels for IoT products, we have to first say, well, what does cybersecurity mean in this context? So, academics have come up with, various different definitions of cybersecurity. Public knowledge has some ideas around this. DCMS, which is in UK, has some idea. UL has some idea, and the Cyber Solarium Commission has had some ideas, as to what IoT cybersecurity labeling should look like. And when it comes to defining security for IoT devices, DCMS, and this is an old charge, this is back, I think, in 2018 or 2019, noted that there are over 50 IoT security best practices, documents, standards, and technical guidance. So the job for the regulator then is which of these 50 best practices, standards, technical guidance should be the right way of defining cybersecurity for IoT, especially when you think about the fact that IoT really is not one technology. There's very little correlation between a connected toothbrush and SCADA systems. So that's a challenge. And by the way, as I pointed out, this is very old. This doesn't even have the NIST cybersecurity baseline. The other problem is that if you do decide to choose a particular set of best practices, and if you choose poorly, that can have business impacts downstream. So this is the Mozilla Trustable Technology mark, and it was a self-assessment that Mozilla had created, which IoT vendors could take, and then if they passed that self-assessment, they could put a mark on their device, say, hey, we have the Mozilla Trustable Technology mark. The only problem with that is that Mozilla discontinued it after a few years, and so if you're a vendor who has put in time, effort, and money to make sure that you're able to get that mark, when that mark goes away, all of your investments are wasted. And these things are expensive to do, to kind of do certification or assessments against a particular kind of standard. So that's one problem. You have to figure out a way to define security for what is basically not one technology, but many, many different technologies. And you have to be very careful that any set of assessments that you choose are going to be long-lasting and not something that is going to be discontinued pretty quickly. The second is, well, what kind of label is appropriate? So, you have things like binary labels. So something like USD organic, if you are from the US, you probably have seen this. You can also have something like energy star labels. So in that case, you have a grading, like, I'm A secure, B secure, C secure kind of thing. Or you can have something like a nutrition label, right? So again, if you've gone to the grocery store recently, you've probably seen nutrition labels on things. There are cybersecurity analogs of all of these different labels. So in UK, the British Standards Institute has something called the Internet of Things kite mark, which is basically a binary label. It's either on the box or not on the box. UL has a graded label, so they use precious metals as a way to grade the security of IoT devices from bronze to diamond. And then, of course, I'm pretty sure everyone in this crowd has seen the Carnegie Mellon nutrition label for IoT devices. The thing is, anyone has any thoughts on which is the best one? Any gut instinct? You really don't. There's no such thing as a best label design, right? Like, I mean, if you work in design, you understand that every design choice has some pros and has some cons, right? So if you're using a binary label, it's really nice, right? All you have to do is you have to check whether the label is present or not. It's highly usable, right? And then from a policy perspective, all you have to do is you have to have a public awareness campaign letting people know and creating awareness that these kinds of labels exist. The problem with that is there's some researchers out of UK who noticed that it creates a dichotomous thinking. So people who look for that label, instead of thinking that those devices come with some baseline security built in, they assume that those devices are essentially unhackable. Like, they're secure devices. Secure means they're unhackable, which is, of course, not the case. Everything is hackable. On the graded label side, it's nicer because it gives you a little bit more, kind of options. Your connected toothbrush doesn't necessarily need to be as secure as your connected TV. The problem with that one, again, from the same study, and I apologize, I forgot to put in the footnote for the reference of that study. They found that people would rather pay more money for a device that is unlabeled than for a device that has the lowest rated label. So basically, a company that has some of the lower ratings on the labels is going to actually get penalized for getting that label, even though they are doing the right thing. And then finally, you have the descriptive label. Instinctively, it sounds great, right? Especially for people who are in this audience. Of course, we want as much information as we possibly can, which is what a descriptive label provides. And there's some research, and I believe that might be also from Carnegie Mellon, which notices that the use of those labels actually correlates with the perceived risk of the technology that is being bought. So, if you believe that your smart TV is more risky than your connected toothbrush, and you're going to pay more attention when it comes to the smart TV. The problem, though, if anyone's tried using nutrition labels in grocery stores, it takes too long. And it requires too much expertise, and it's too easy to kind of put things on the label that are very hard for people to understand. So it's the least usable, and in addition to awareness, it also requires significant consumer literacy. So again, I'm not saying one of them is better than the other, but the thing is that there are trade-offs that you have to make as a policymaker to figure out which one's the right option. By the way, I think FCC has hit a pretty good balance here, where the actual label is binary, but then there's a QR code, so if you want to see more details, you do get to see a more nutrition style label. So it sort of serves the a market where consumers don't have high levels of literacy, but it also serves cybersecurity experts who want to see more information about the label. But then there are other challenges as well. So again, from usability perspective, this will resonate with a lot of people in this crowd. You have to then decide, let's say you're just picking a binary label, right? So great. Well, then you have to decide what is the icon that goes on that label. So in the case of the British Standards Institute, they decided that they're not going to have a separate icon. So they had a standard for Internet of Things, and they just built security into that standard, and then they had the same label they've had before. So the benefit of that is you don't have to do separate consumer awareness campaigns. The consumers are already familiar with the kite mark label. They don't have to look for something else. But on the other hand, if you are really trying to differentiate your devices on security, it really helps to have a separate mark for security. So in Finland, they're using a lock icon. I'm pretty sure everyone's read the literature on the use of lock icons in cybersecurity, and the many, many challenges of it and how it is overused comes with a lot of presumptions about what it means. If you're using a graded style label, you have to figure out, well, what should be my framing for that grade? So if I'm putting in a grade, red to green, right, and something like A to F, green to red, and then something like A to F, well, the red is really going to look like a failure grade, right? Like red indicates danger, so you are just going to associate that with, oh, this device is actually unsafe, even though it might be safer or more secure than an unlabeled device. So the framing is very important. UL, again, I think they've done a good job where they've used precious metals. So bronze is not as valuable as diamond, but bronze is still better than not having any metal at all. So potentially that works better than the red to green kind of scale. But again, there's no, it's not like there's any public studies on this, so we don't know. And then finally, if you're using a nutrition style label, well, then you have to figure out what all goes on that nutrition label, right? Like you have to figure out what are the information elements that you want to include as part of that label, and then are there icons that go with that information? So I again apologize, I forgot to put a footnote for this one, but I think this is a label from some researchers out of North Carolina, but you can see the amount of information that is there, it's very, very hard to process. So here's my recommendation, right? We are never going to be able to do the number of studies that we need to do to analyze each and every one of these elements. So simplify, when you're coming up with a label, use the minimum amount of design elements that you can, and all of the elements that you do use, make sure that you are, doing something to ensure that it actually serves the function that you're trying to get it to serve. And that kind of ties into usability, right? So labels at the end of the day have to be designed to serve low literacy consumers. Unfortunately, a lot of standard setting, policy making is done by experts. And so they feel, oh, we need more, but more is not necessarily always better. Just think of cake. One slice of cake is lovely. If you have a whole cake, it's going to give you a little bit of a tummy ache. So you have to balance basically, and then you have to make sure that any program that you come up with is sustainable, because at the end of the day, vendors have to make certain amounts of investments in these programs, and if those programs are not going to be around for a long time, those are capital investments that are going to go to waste, and then vendors are not going to do it the next time you come up with a program. So there's a lot of complexity. And by the way, I've only touched upon 30% of what has gone into coming up with the US Trust Mark program. There's so much more that the private sector has been working on, figuring out what are the different kinds of assessments, what should be the assessment report, what should be the standard for the assessment report. There's a ton of work that is happening in Consumer Technology Association, which is an ANSI standard body. So if you're interested in any of those things, please participate in there. I know Consumer Reports participates in there, Carnegie Mellon participates in there. So it is, ANSI is an open standards process, so you are allowed to participate. So as I mentioned, like the first takeaway is policy making is significantly more complex than policy ideation. How much time do I have?
Just a few minutes now, like 5 minutes.
Oh, I have 5 minutes remaining. Okay, so I think I'm going to, I did not realize that. So I'm going to quickly skip over some slides, but let's revisit the misaligned incentives argument, right? So the thing is, information asymmetry might exist for the regular consumer, but enterprise programs have vendor risk assessment programs, they have third-party risk assessment programs. They do look at cybersecurity risk when they're buying devices. Externalities, well, they are increasingly getting internalized because of ransomware. And then network effects, as it turns out, manifestation of cybersecurity risk is greatest in interoperable technologies. So again, enterprises do care about that. So given the complexity of policy making, we may not have to actually create as many interventions as we think. Just very quickly, as it turns out, if you look at incentives, there's a lot of incentives to invest in cybersecurity. Given that I'm running over time, I'm not going to go over all of them. But there's this really nice piece of research from Eric Jardine, who used to be at Virginia Tech, has now gone into the industry, where he points out that cybersecurity is actually safer than we think. So, back in the day, you had 10 websites, 2 of them got breached, and you're like, oh, there's only 2 breaches happening. But now you have 100 websites, you have 10 breaches, and you're like, oh my God, like breaches are increasing. You used to have 2 breaches, but you have 10 breaches. But you're not looking at is the size of the cyberspace. I mean, if you start taking that into account, you realize the rates of attacks, or the successful rate of attacks, is actually going down. And the reason why it's going down is that for all, despite the academic arguments of why companies don't have an incentive to invest in cybersecurity, back in 2003, very close to when Ross wrote that paper, the amount of cybersecurity investment was $3.5 billion. And then 2025, which is the year that we are in, the global cybersecurity investment is $1 trillion. So there's an academic argument that there's not an incentive to invest in cybersecurity, but in reality, there's a massive amount of money that is being spent on cybersecurity. The thing is, these investments are not distributed evenly. Largely, these investments are being made by very mature organizations, sort of Fortune 50, Fortune 500 kind of companies. But we do still have a challenge with, small, mid-sized companies that kind of struggle with cybersecurity investments. And then, of course, like incentives are also not uniformly distributed, right? So, not every company has an incentive to invest in cybersecurity. There are certain sectors where you have greater incentives, certain sectors where you have less incentive. So when you're thinking about creating policy interventions, you should focus on sectors where there's fewer incentives, or there's, incentives that are less effective, and and focus on those. Just because, again, as I pointed out, thinking of a cybersecurity policy is, relatively easy, but then taking that policy idea and making it into, a policy governance structure is actually pretty hard. I'm guessing I'm over time now. Okay.
We have a few minutes if you want to wrap up things.
No, I think I'll have to stop. Apologies.
Yeah, no worries. Great. Thank you so much. Great. So we would like to keep this interactive, and that's why I feel like we have a Q&A. I'm sure you have a lot of questions as we are talking about privacy policies labels. And this question, of course, like if there are 50 different, we don't know as cybersecurity experts where to go, right? So any questions from the audience? Okay, oh yeah, go ahead. When you're asking a question, please introduce yourself.
I'm Shaya Yu from University of Hampshire. So in the first lesson, you mentioned that you talk about the policy making is more complicated than implementation, right? So how does the company typically do assessment of what the risk of the new policy they're going to make? Because the motivation for no policy is clear, right? But how do you
So I'm just going to repeat the question in case people didn't hear. But I think like your question was, how does a company estimate the risk of a new policy? So the first, and when you say policy, basically like a new policy that is coming from the government, right? So I think you have to look at the costs that that policy will impose. That is typically the place that most companies would start. The other thing that you'd look at is the regulatory authority behind that policy. So if an agency is coming out with a policy, does it actually have the regulatory authority to impose that policy? Because that's where a lot of debate happens back and forth. That is not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is looking at the technical dimension of that policy. Like, does that policy make sense from a technical perspective? And what are going to be the benefits of that policy? So I'm going to stick to the thing that I talked about, like IoT labeling policy, right? So the way we think about it is that there's always going to, if you're only going to compete on price, right? You're really going to drive the market down very, very quickly, and that's not necessarily the thing that we want to compete on, because all of these IoT devices, if they're insecure, they're going to be connected to our network, and they're going to create problems for that network. So the way we think about it is that if you're going to have labels, it would encourage people to get better products, and it will not drive the market down just based on price. People are also going to look at quality of the product, where security is one aspect of the quality. So you're not just looking at the risks, you're also looking at the opportunities and what is the broader benefits that you get when a certain policy is implemented. But then you also have to look at like what is the process for providing feedback into that policy making process. So like one example would be something like NIST. NIST typically has a pretty open process where anyone can participate and anyone can provide feedback. And so, so the whole process is very transparent. NIST publishes documents on, all of the public solicitations it does. FCC, CISA, typically have something similar. But if there happens to be a place where the policy process becomes opaque, where you cannot understand why the policy maker make a certain decision, or you cannot provide feedback back to the policymaker and say, hey, this doesn't make sense for our industry, that's when those are the kinds of risks that you look at. So you don't just look at the risk of the policy, you also look at the benefits, and you also look at the risk of the policy-making process itself. Not sure if that helped, but hopefully answered the question.
I think, hello. Yeah, I think that's really great that when we are talking about cybersecurity, one of the positive things is basically cybersecurity is better than where we started off. So that was one of the positive things. And also like, it's not about just the risk of privacy policies, but it's also about the process. I think that is absolutely important when we are talking about real world application. Any other questions? We now have a mic, so. Yes.
John Sadiq, the University of Tennessee. So when you talk about labels, can you speak a little bit to maybe the need for updating these labels over time as maybe standards change or manufacturing changes? So would that place a bigger burden on some of these regulatory agencies? And is there really a need for a lot of updating to these labels, or do you think that the space for it would produce consistent labels, or should I say persistent labels?
Right. So I think on the label itself, you want to keep it as consistent as you possibly can, because once the consumer has an understanding of a particular design, it's too much cognitive effort to get them to change their, and have them relearn, oh, this is a new label, this means this kind of thing. But as technology evolves, the back-end assessment processes can change. So that is something that UL is currently doing. So UL has these 3 working groups. They last month they had a public solicitation. So apologies, I didn't provide some context. So FCC is the owner of the US Trust Mark label. FCC has hired, UL has become the lead label administrator that is going to basically come up with all of the processes for assessments, for relabeling, all of those things for the FCC. And then there are going to be different labeling agent authorities that are going to work with UL to get devices certified. So the assessment process can definitely change over time because that's something that is not visible to the end user. That's only something that is visible to the vendors who are trying to get their devices assessed and get them certified. But again, they shouldn't be they shouldn't get updated too frequently. In terms of what is the need for updating them, I don't know if there's a need to update them that regularly if you are outcome focused. So again, that's something that we typically look at, whether the policy focuses on the outcome, right? So the outcome could be, well, you have some kind of secure authentication built into your device, right? Versus if you're focused on a specific technology, so something like that says that, hey, every device needs to have a unique default password. Because what if the technology evolves beyond passwords? What if your devices do not use passwords? So, it's much, so again, like, as you're designing these policy interventions, you have to think about how to keep them sustainable, so make them outcome focused, keep them risk informed, and you're more likely to get more sustainable policy. Jeremy?
Jeremy Epstein, former NSF, White House, DARPA, a bunch of other places. I'm wondering whether there's been any study of the NHTSA crash tests that we see when we buy a car that, 1 through 5 stars, they update them periodically. How much does that actually affect people's buying decisions, both for new cars and used cars? And how much do the updates to those periodically change them? And what can we learn from that? Granted, cars have a much longer cycle time than, say, IoT devices, but is there anything we can get from that?
So that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that. So when I was working on the paper on labeling, I was primarily looking at food labels rather than car labels. But But I would say I think like that's a good example of when you're making cybersecurity policy, you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. It's better to kind of look at how policy has been implemented in other places, and it's not necessarily going to tell you how to make policy for cybersecurity, but it will at least tell you which pitfalls to avoid. But I don't have an answer to how it's done for cars. Go ahead.
Jordan McLeod, MIT Lincoln Laboratory. Your comparison for descriptive labeling was nutritional, of course. That's both for like a physical product and it's a bit more qualitative. Is there a reason why something like more, quantitative, not qualitative, why you are not looking at like more qualitative examples like TV guides, for example, or things for how does this actually work for if you're looking at an IoT device, of course, it's a physical product, but for like a website, it's not as helpful.
So, to be honest, I'm not really doing like hands-on first-party research into any of these. What I'm trying to point out here is that it doesn't matter which kind of label you choose. You're going to, whichever design you choose, there's going to be some benefits for it and some negatives for it. And so you're going to have to make that trade-off as a policymaker to decide which benefits in which context are more appropriate than which negatives for that context. So as you're making policy, you can't just say, well, I'm going to have a label for IoT devices. You're going to have to figure out all of the different elements of that label. And then at each point, you'll have to make design choices that are going to be favorable for certain kinds of consumers and going to be unfavorable for other kinds of consumers. So that's where the complexity lies, and that's where, it's not, you're not going to have a Pareto optimal solution saying that, in this case, this kind of label is just better for everyone. That's all I'm trying to point out.
Great. We have time for one or two last questions. So while you're thinking about it, I have a quick question. So some of the works which we are working on, and shameless plug, one of my students is presenting on Thursday about privacy policy updates and everything. But that said, so given that we are now going for more automated classification of privacy so that it is more usable for the end users, right? So given the privacy, the IoT labels, what do you envision how it can impact the automated privacy policy analysis or detection?
So privacy policies are slightly different, right? Because they're not public policy that is made by the government, right? Like privacy policies are more, something that a private sector agency or private sector company defines for itself. I don't think. I mean, I think it can. You can potentially create tools. I think like Carnegie Mellon had a tool where, you could go and like get like a nutrition stable label style thing for privacy policies for certain companies. So those kinds of toolings will probably become more available. Are they actually going to drive consumer behavior? I don't think so. I mean, I love a lot of the work that our communities do, right? But a lot of the work that our communities do are of interest to us. And it's not necessarily of interest to a general consumer, because like the tooling for comparing privacy policies is defined as tooling that would be used by a general consumer, but it typically wouldn't be. So you have to think about who is going to be a consumer. And so Serge Egelman, did at ICSI did some work on analyzing. Doing like dynamic analysis of APIs for privacy violations, and he set up a company that that now basically does that as as private sector work. And what's been really interesting is that his customers are not end users; his customers are regulators. So as you're doing all of this work, you have to think about who's the customer for your work, because a lot of the work that you guys are publishing can be very good for informing policymakers, but a lot of times when we publish studies or we think like that would be like good for a general audience. And I would really encourage people, especially we are in a very different policy climate today than we were a month ago, if anyone's been following the news, right? So whether that's whether you're in favor of that or if you're against that, but if you really I think if you want to inform that policy process and go like you want to sort of look at like what is the impact of the research that you're doing, I would say like in addition to publishing at academic venues, really start publishing blogs, because that's a policymaker, they're not going to have time to read a 20-page paper or even a 10-page paper or even a 4-page paper. What they're looking for is something that is actionable, maybe 300 words at best. And look at venues which publish that kind of work that is going to be read by policymakers. And I think like we should help create better policy as much as we can in our individual capacities, because if we don't push out good policy ideas, there'll be other people pushing out bad policy ideas. Anyways, that's my personal rant. But
no, I think that's very important, right? We should make sure that it is actually applicable to the real world situations. So we have time for one last very quick question, if we have any. Okay, so I think we are all ready for the break, but let's thank again Dr. Garg.
Thank you all.